The rain had a rhythm that night is slow, steady tapping against the windows that filled the silence in Emma's house. It was the kind of sound that once felt comforting, but now only reminded her of how empty the rooms had become. Emma sat by the kitchen window with a cup of tea gone cold in her hands. The clock on the wall ticked softly, every second echoing louder than it should. It was almost midnight, and Daniel still hadn't come home. Her eyes drifted to the small picture frame on the counter. Photograph taken 5 years ago. In it, Emma stood between her husband, Mark, and a smiling teenage Daniel. They were laughing, arms around each other, sunlight streaming through the trees behind them. Life had felt full, then uncomplicated, predictable, and warm. But that was before the accident, before the night she stood in a hospital room and heard the doctor's voice break the world in two. Since Mark's passing, Emma had done her best to keep their lives stitched together. She worked part-time at the library, tended to her small garden, and tried to fill her evenings with the quiet comfort of books and tea. But no matter how much she tried, there were moments when the silence in the house felt heavier than grief itself. Daniel had changed too. He was 24 now, kind, hardworking, and strong like his father, but his eyes carried a weight Emma didn't know how to lift. He had taken a job at the local auto shop, often working late, and though he lived under the same roof, it felt as though they were worlds apart. There was still love between them. She could feel it in the way he'd glance at her before leaving, or the way he'd fix the squeaky door without being asked. But there was distance, too, and neither of them knew how to bridge it. Emma sighed, placing her untouched tea on the table. Outside, the rain thickened, blurring the glow of the streetlights. She stood and walked toward Daniel's room, pausing at the door. It was slightly ajar. Inside, the bed was neatly made. His jacket hung over the chair, and a few sketches were scattered across his desk, drawings of cars, mostly, but also one she hadn't seen before. It was a sketch of their old family home, the same porch, the same garden, even the red bicycle Daniel used to ride as a boy. Her heart caught in her throat. She hadn't realized he remembered it so clearly. She smiled softly, tracing her finger along the edge of the paper. Beneath the drawing, written in faint pencil, were the words, "Someday I'll build it again." Emma blinked back tears. Maybe, she thought, her son wasn't as far away as she feared. Maybe he just didn't know how to talk about it, about missing his father, about growing up, about feeling lost in a world that kept moving forward when theirs had stopped. The sound of the front door startled her. It opened slowly, followed by the squeak of wet shoes on the entry mat. Daniel stepped in, his hair damp from the rain, his jacket streaked with grease. "You're still up?" he asked, his voice low and tired. "I couldn't sleep," Emma said, forcing a small smile. "Long day." "Yeah," he muttered, setting his keys down. "Shop's been busy." She wanted to ask more too, ask if he was eating enough, work was treating him well, if he was really okay, but she held her tongue. Lately, their conversations ended before they began. "I saved you some dinner," she offered. "Thanks." "Mom, I'm not really hungry." He started toward his room, but paused when he noticed the sketch in her hand. For a second, his eyes softened. "You found that? It's beautiful," she said gently. "Your father would have loved it." Daniel looked away, his jaw tightening. "Yeah, maybe." He turned before she could say more, disappearing down the hall. A door closed softly behind him. Emma stood there for a moment, listening to the faint hum of the rain and the quiet ache of words unsaid. She wished she knew how to reach him, to tell him that he didn't have to carry his pain alone, that it was okay to let her in again. But instead, she whispered into the empty room, "Good night, sweetheart," and turned off the kitchen light in his room. Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the same photo Emma had been holding hours earlier. He ran a thumb over his father's smile, feeling a familiar sting behind his eyes. He didn't mean to shut his mother out. He just didn't know how to be both her son and the man he thought his father wanted him to become. Every time he looked at her, he saw the grief she tried so hard to hide him. He didn't want to add to it. But tonight, seeing the light under her door even passed, Midnight made something twist in his chest. He thought about the words he'd written under the sketch. Someday, I'll build it again. He had meant the house, but now in the quiet. He wondered if he also meant them his family, his connection with her. Everything that had fallen apart since that night. He laid back, listening to the rain and her soft footsteps down the hall. For a long time, neither of them slept, somewhere between wakefulness and dreams. A single thought crossed his mind. Tomorrow, I'll make things right, but neither of them knew how fragile. Tomorrow could be or how easily one mistake could change everything. The next morning, Emma found a note on the kitchen table. It was Daniel's handwriting. Sorry, Mom. Had to cover another shift. Don't wait up. Her heart sank. That night was supposed to be special, the anniversary of his father's passing. They had promised to spend it together, sharing stories and lighting a candle in his memory. Emma sat at the table, staring at the empty chair across from her. The candle flickered. But Daniel's absence felt heavier than the silence itself. When Daniel finally came home after midnight, he found her asleep at the table, the candle burned down to nothing. His chest tightened. He hadn't meant to hurt her, but lately, everything he did seemed to go wrong. The following week unfolded quietly, though Emma felt anything but calm. Every time she passed Ryan in the hallway, every shared smile or simple good morning seemed charged with a new, unspoken energy. Nothing inappropriate, just different. A little too warm, a little too aware. She told herself it was just in her head. That email was old news, and Ryan had moved on. But her heart wasn't convinced. It held on to every small thing, the way he'd thanked her, the memory of his soft tone when he said he respected her by Friday afternoon. She had managed to settle back into routine. Reports, meetings, coffee breaks, the rhythm of ordinary life. Then, right before closing time, small event broke the calm in the most unexpected way. It started with a power outage. The lights flickered once, before the entire office went dark. A murmur of surprise swept through the building, followed by laughter and a few groans. Emma stood from her desk, peering toward the window. Heavy gray clouds had rolled in again, turning the late afternoon sky almost black. Someone joked about going home early, but Ryan's voice rose from the corner, steady and reassuring. Let's wait a few minutes. The generator should kick in soon. But at DIDN, single quotes too, the office grew quiet except for the rain and the distant rumble of thunder. Emma reached for her phone flashlight, casting a soft glow over her desk. As she gathered her things, she noticed Ryan walking by, checking on everyone before they left. When he reached her desk, he smiled. You okay? She nodded. Just finishing up. Guess the storm has other plans for us. He chuckled. Seems that way. The elevator's out too. Looks like we'll have to take the stairs. They waited until the last few employees left, then made their way toward the stairwell. The building was unusually silent, the hum of computers gone, replaced by the distant patter of rain and the soft echo of their footsteps. The stairwell was dim, lit only by the faint glow of emergency lights. Halfway down, Emma's phone flashlight flickered and died. Great timing, she muttered. Ryan pulled out his own phone and raised it slightly. Don't worry, I've got it. The light illuminated his face, soft and steady. For a moment they both paused, neither speaking. Just standing there in the quiet, listening to the storm outside, and then, as if fate had decided to add one more twist, they heard a sound, a crash, like something falling near the lobby. Ryan frowned. That didn't sound good. They hurried down the rest of the stairs and pushed open the door to find part of the ceiling tile had collapsed from a leak. Water pooled near the reception desk. Nothing serious, but enough to make a mess. Ryan sighed, setting his jacket aside. Let's at least make sure no one's hurt. As he assessed the situation, Emma grabbed a few towels from the janitor's closet and began drying the floor. Together, they worked in quiet rhythm, the kind that comes naturally to people who understand each other without needing to speak. At one point, their hands brushed as they reached for the same towel. It was such a small thing, yet the moment froze time for a heartbeat. They both paused, looked at each other. and then laughed softly, the kind of laugh that eases tension instead of deepening it. "I guess fate wanted us to work overtime together," Emma said. Ryan shook his head, smiling. "Seems like fate's been doing that a lot lately." When the power finally returned, the lights blinked back to life, flooding the room in a soft, golden glow. The storm had begun to fade outside, leaving behind only the sound of gentle rain. Emma glanced around the lobby. It wasn't perfect, still damp in places, but it looked better than before. She turned toward Ryan, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Well, crisis averted." "Thanks to you," he said. "You always step up when things go wrong." She smiled. "Maybe I just like fixing things." He looked at her for a long moment before replying quietly. "Not everything that's broken needs fixing, Emma. Some things just need understanding." The softness in his tone caught her off guard. She met his gaze, and in it, she saw something honest vulnerability, the kind he usually hid beneath his calm, professional exterior. "Ryan," she began gently, "are you okay?" He exhaled slowly, his eyes drifting toward the rain-slicked windows. "Yeah, just been thinking lately about how easily we get caught up in work, in routine, and how much we miss without realizing it." Emma nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I know exactly what you mean." It wasn't a confession, but it felt like one. A quiet bridge built between two people who had been walking parallel paths for years. For a while, neither of them spoke. The hum of returning electricity filled the silence, mingling with the rain's final rhythm. Then Ryan broke the stillness with a small smile. "Do you want to ride home? It's pouring out there." Emma hesitated. "You don't have to, I know," he said gently, "but I'd like to." The drive was calm, the city lights blurring against the wet windshield. They spoke softly about small things, about old office stories, even about the time Emma accidentally ordered 200 pens instead of 20. But beneath the laughter was something unspoken, something fragile at a red light. Ryan glanced her way. "You know, I've always admired how you handle people. You listen before you speak. That's rare." Emma smiled faintly. "I learned that from someone." Their eyes met for a moment that lingered just long enough to say what neither dared to voice. When he finally pulled up in front of her apartment building, she turned to thank him. "But he spoke first, Emma," he said softly. "That message you sent, it might have been a mistake, but maybe it wasn't an accident." Her breath caught before she could reply. He smiled and added, "Sometimes the smallest moments show us what's been right in front of us all along." Then, as if sensing her heart needed time to catch up, he said goodnight and drove off, leaving Emma standing under the soft drizzle, her heart full of questions and quiet hope. That night she stood by her window, watching the city lights shimmer through the fading rain. The storm had passed, but something had changed, something invisible yet undeniable. It wasn't love. Not yet, but it was the beginning of something real and deep inside. Emma knew this story, the one she thought began with a mistake, was only just beginning. The following week settled into its usual rhythm. But for Emma, nothing felt ordinary. The storm from last Friday had left more than wet streets, and puddles. It had left a lingering tension she couldn't shake. Every time Ryan entered the office, her heart seemed to skip, even though they hadn't spoken directly about the moment in the stairwell or the quiet drive home. Emma told herself it was silly. He was her boss after all. And yet there was something in the way he looked at her lately, a softness, a pause, a glance that lingered just a little too long. She caught herself imagining conversations that hadn't happened, possibilities that might never exist. Ryan felt it too, though he didn't admit it. He prided himself on professionalism, on being composed and measured. But lately, his thoughts wandered in ways he hadn't allowed himself before. Emma had always been capable, thoughtful, and steady. But the email, the message she had called a mistake, had shifted. Something inside him. He admired her more than he realized. Not just her dedication to work, but the way she noticed small details, the quiet way she encouraged others, the subtle warmth she brought to a room. And yet he hesitated. There was the unspoken rule of office boundaries, the careful line between boss and employee, and the ever-present fear of misreading signals. It was the kind of tension that it made everyday interactions charged with meaning. A shared laugh in the kitchen felt electric. Passing in the hallway carried a momentary pause. Even a brief smile lingered longer than it should have. And still, neither of them said anything. One rainy afternoon, Emma found herself at her desk long after everyone else had left. The office was quiet, the hum of computers and distant city sounds the only background to her thoughts. She stared at the empty chair across from her, remembering how Ryan had always been there quietly, ready to help without needing thanks. Her mind drifted to a memory from months ago, a lunch in the small park across the street. They had been the only two in the break room that day, talking about books, childhood stories, and favorite childhood movies. Ryan had laughed at a story about her little brother hiding cookies in a sock drawer, and Emma had felt the rare, comforting ease of being truly understood. It was moments like that she realized that had quietly built her admiration, her connection, and yes, something deeper that she hadn't yet dared to name. Meanwhile, Ryan stared out the window of his office, listening to the steady rain. He thought of her laugh, her thoughtful gestures, the way she always seemed to notice when someone needed encouragement. He had spent years managing people, watching relationships unfold, knowing how complicated hearts could be. And yet, his own heart had quietly taken note of her, hesitated, and then settled on a longing he wasn't ready to voice. He shook his head slightly, as if to clear the thoughts. Not now, not yet. Keep the boundary. But his eyes lingered on her desk as she typed away, oblivious to the silent storm building between them. Days passed with the same quiet rhythm. They shared smiles, brief conversations, and small gestures, holding doors, offering coffee, checking in on deadlines, but the weight of unspoken feelings pressed softly beneath the surface. Both wanted to say more. Both feared the consequences if they did. One afternoon, they found themselves working late again. The office was mostly dark, only the glow of their screens illuminating their desks. Emma L. The morning sun spilled across the town in golden streaks, glinting off wet rooftops and puddles left by last night's rain. Emma stood on her porch, clutching her sweater tighter around her shoulders. The air smelled of damp earth and autumn leaves, fresh and bittersweet. She had woken early, though she hadn't meant to. Sleep had become unpredictable lately, drifting in and out like the wind. Her mind was restless, looping through memories and questions that never seemed to find answers. Today felt different, though she couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the sunlight or the faint sound of laughter from the street below. Or maybe she thought it was just that part of her still believed something was about to change. She walked down to the mailbox and found an envelope tucked among the usual bills. It was addressed to her in Daniel's handwriting. No return address. Her heartbeat quickened. Inside, she found a small folded note and a photo one she hadn't seen before. It was a picture of her and Mark taken years ago at the county fair. They were laughing, her hand resting on his shoulder, his hat slightly crooked. On the back, in Daniel's careful script, were 5 words. "I found this for you." Beneath it, smaller letters read, "Thought you'd want it back." Emma's throat tightened. It wasn't the photograph itself that moved her, but the thought that Daniel had taken the time to find it, to remember. She pressed the picture to her chest and closed her eyes. Maybe this was his way of reaching out, she thought. Maybe this was his first step back toward her, that evening. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma decided to do something she hadn't done in years. She baked Daniel's favorite pie-a-pal with cinnamon and sugar crust, just like her mother used to make. She wanted to surprise him, to remind him of simpler days when comfort came from small things: a warm kitchen, a shared laugh, a slice of pie cooling by the window by the time she finished. The house smelled like home again. She wrapped the pie in foil and placed it on the counter. Then she sat at the kitchen table, waiting for the sound of his truck in the driveway. But the hours passed, and the house grew quiet. When she finally reached for her phone, her thumb hovered over his name. Should she call? Would he even answer? Before she could decide, headlights swept across the window. Her heart leaped. Daniel's truck rolled into the driveway, its engine rumbling low before cutting off. Moments later, he stepped through the door, looking worn but calmer than usual. "Smells good in here," he said, kicking off his boots. Emma smiled softly. "I made your favorite. Thought you might like a slice before it cools." Daniel looked surprised, almost guilty. "You didn't have to, Mom. I wanted to." He hesitated before sitting down at the table. Emma sliced the pie, the knife sliding cleanly through the warm crust. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sounds were the quiet clinking of plates and the soft hum of the refrigerator. Then Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small. "I found this at Dad's old workshop," he said. "Figured it belonged to you." He set it on the tabula brass key, slightly tarnished, attached to a faded leather tag. Emma's breath caught. This was the key to the cabin. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, I thought maybe we could go there sometime, fix it up a bit." She stared at him, unable to speak for a moment. That cabin had been their getaway, the place where Mark taught Daniel to fish, where they built fires and watched stars through the cracked roof. She hadn't been there since the funeral. Her eyes softened. "You'd want to go back?" Daniel shrugged, but his voice was gentle. "I think Dad would have wanted us to." Something shifted between them, then something small but profound. For the first time in years, they weren't just mother and son dancing around unspoken pain. They were two people finding their way through it together. They spent the next hour talking. Not about the past, not directly, but about little things: the shop, the weather, the neighbors, a stray cat that kept showing up behind the garage. But underneath it all, there was warmth again, and laughter that came more easily than before. At one point, Daniel leaned back in his chair and said, "I used to think coming home would make everything harder, but it doesn't feel that way now." Emma looked at him, her eyes glistening. "Home isn't supposed to be hard, Daniel. It's supposed to help you breathe." He smiled, just barely, but enough for her to see the boy she once knew. Later that night, after he'd gone to bed, Emma picked up the brass key and held it under the lamp's glow. It felt heavier than she remembered, as if it carried all the years between then and now. Maybe it did. Maybe she thought that was the point. As she turned off the light and headed to her room, she paused outside Daniel's door. The faint sound of his music drifted through the woods, something slow and thoughtful. It wasn't the noise of anger or frustration, but of calm. She smiled to herself. Fate had a strange way of mending what time had broken. A lost photograph, a tarnished key, a pie on the tables, small things that carried the weight of love and forgiveness. Emma didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, she felt hope settling quietly in her chest, and somewhere between that hope and the sound of the rain starting again, she whispered a silent prayer that this time, her son wouldn't walk away. The house felt alive again. Emma brewed tea while Daniel repaired the old wooden chair his father once sat in. They talked late into the night about memories, mistakes, and the kind of love that endures even after the hardest days. As the sun rose, Emma looked at him and smiled softly. "You didn't really cross the line, Daniel. You just needed to find your way back." Daniel nodded, his eyes filled with quiet gratitude. "I'm home, Mom, for good this time." And in that gentle morning light, their story wasn't about heartbreak any. What was about healing?